A simple statement in a corporate boardroom becomes the catalyst for the most humbling lesson a billionaire CEO will ever receive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Blackstone Industries' 52nd floor, where Richard Blackstone stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, surveying the city below like a modern-day emperor reviewing his domain. At 58, he commanded a global consulting empire worth $4 billion, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit worth more than most people's monthly salary, and his reputation for crushing competition as legendary as his disdain for anyone he deemed intellectually inferior. Richard had built his fortune on one simple principle: intelligence was rare, and those who possessed it deserved to rule over those who didn't. His company, Blackstone Industries, specialized in international business consulting, helping multinational corporations navigate complex global markets. But more than the money, Richard relished the power that came with being the smartest person in every room he entered. "Mr. Blackstone," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the morning executive meeting is ready to begin." Richard adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a gift to himself after closing a deal that had eliminated 3,000 jobs across Eastern Europe while increasing his clients' profits by 12%. He felt no remorse about such decisions. In his worldview, business was about survival of the fittest, and he had proven himself to be the apex predator of the corporate ecosystem. The executive boardroom was a testament to his success, a mahogany table that could seat 20 people, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than luxury cars. The walls displayed his collection of degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and Wharton, along with awards from prestigious business organizations worldwide. Through the panoramic windows, the rest of New York City spread out below, a constant reminder that he stood above it all. His senior team was already assembled. Margaret Hayes, his sharp-tongued VP of Operations, who had climbed the corporate ladder by being even more ruthless than her male counterparts. James Mitchell, the head of Human Resources, who specialized in finding creative ways to eliminate redundant personnel. And David Chen, his chief financial officer, who could make numbers dance to any tune Richard desired. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Today we're interviewing candidates for the new International Relations Director position. I want you to remember that this role requires someone who can handle our most sophisticated clients across 6 continents." "What's the profile we're looking for?" Margaret asked, flipping through a stack of resumes that had been pre-screened by 3 different recruitment agencies. Ivy League education, minimum 10 years of international business experience, fluency in at least 3 major languages, and the intellectual capacity to match our standards, Richard replied. "I won't have some amateur representing Blackstone Industries to our billionaire clients." James nodded approvingly. "We've already eliminated 200 applications that didn't meet our baseline requirements. The remaining 5 candidates are all from top-tier backgrounds." Richard had developed his hiring philosophy over decades of what he considered to be hard-earned wisdom. In his experience, people from ordinary backgrounds lacked the sophistication and cultural capital necessary to operate in elite circles. They might be technically competent, but they would never have the instinctive understanding of power dynamics that came from generational privilege. "I want to particularly scrutinize their language abilities," Richard continued. "Too many candidates claim fluency when they can barely order coffee in a foreign language. We need someone who can conduct complex negotiations in multiple languages without embarrassing our firm." David pulled up the first candidate's profile on the wall-mounted screen. "Harvard MBA, speaks French and German, 5 years at McKinsey, impeccable references." "Send her in," Richard commanded, settling back to enjoy what he anticipated would be an easy morning of demonstrating his intellectual superiority over a parade of inferior candidates. The first interview proceeded exactly as Richard expected. The Harvard graduate was polished, professional, and utterly predictable. Her French was adequate for tourist conversations, but crumbled under the pressure of technical business terminology. Her German was even weaker. Richard dismissed her with barely concealed contempt. The second candidate, a Wharton alumnus with Wall Street experience, fared slightly better but still failed to impress Richard when asked to discuss market strategies in what he claimed was fluent Spanish. The pronunciation was acceptable, but the vocabulary was limited, and the complex concepts were clearly beyond his linguistic capabilities. "Is this really the best the recruitment agencies could find?" Richard asked his team after dismissing the third candidate, another disappointment from Columbia Business School. I'm beginning to think we should raise our standards even higher. There are 2 more candidates scheduled. James consulted his tablet. The 4th one should be arriving shortly. Richard was considering canceling the remaining interviews when his assistant's voice came through the intercom again. Mr. Blackstone, the next candidate is here. However, I should mention that she seems quite young and isn't dressed like the others. What do you mean? Richard's voice carried an edge of irritation. She appears to be in her early 20s, wearing casual clothes and carrying a backpack instead of a briefcase. Richard exchanged glances with his team, all of whom looked equally puzzled. Did someone make a mistake with the screening process? He asked James. I'll double-check the file, James said, typing rapidly on his laptop. Her resume shows a degree from Columbia, but this is strange. It lists an extraordinary number of languages and some unusual qualifications. Well, send her in, Richard decided. This should be entertaining. I could use a good laugh before lunch. Margaret smirked. Should we take bets on how quickly she'll embarrass herself? I give her 5 minutes before she admits she's in over her head. David chuckled. Richard leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been in a particularly good mood since closing a deal the previous week that had tripled the consulting fees for a project that would result in massive layoffs across 3 countries. Now he had the opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual supremacy over some confused young woman who had somehow slipped through the screening process. The boardroom door opened, and Richard prepared to enjoy what he anticipated would be the most amusing interview of his career. He had no idea that the next 20 minutes would shatter every assumption he had ever made about intelligence, competence, and the relationship between privilege and ability. The young woman who entered would challenge not just his hiring criteria, but his entire worldview, and by the time she left, Richard Blackstone would be forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform both the hunter and the hunted, though Richard had no way of knowing that he was about to become the prey. The silence in the boardroom was broken by the soft sound of sneakers on marble flooring as Victoria Sterling entered with a confidence that immediately contradicted her casual appearance. At 22, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that expensive clothes and professional styling usually tried to create artificially, but which seemed to emanate naturally from her composed demeanor and intelligent eyes. She wore dark jeans, a simple navy blue sweater, and carried a worn leather backpack that looked like it had traveled the world multiple times. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for small silver earrings that caught the light as she moved. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had walked into the wrong building by mistake. Richard felt his eyebrows raise involuntarily as he took in the sight of this young woman who looked more like a college student than a candidate for a senior executive position. Margaret's lips pursed in disapproval. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and James seemed to be double-checking his screening notes with growing confusion. Ms. Sterling, I presume, Richard said, his voice carrying the condescending tone he typically reserved for interns and service staff. Please, have a seat. Victoria approached the massive conference table with unhurried steps, pulling out the chair directly across from Richard and settling into it with a poise that surprised everyone in the room. She placed her backpack on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands on the table, meeting Richard's gaze with steady, unblinking eyes. Thank you for the opportunity to interview today, Victoria said, her voice clear and professional despite her youthful appearance. I understand you're looking for someone to head your international relations division. Richard leaned back in his chair, already planning the questions that would expose her obvious inadequacy. Indeed we are. This position requires someone who can represent Blackstone Industries to our most prestigious clients worldwide. Tell me, Ms. Sterling, what makes you think you're qualified for such a demanding role? I believe my language abilities and cultural competency would be valuable assets to your organization, Victoria replied calmly. International business is ultimately about communication and understanding, and I've spent considerable time developing those skills. Margaret couldn't suppress a small laugh. Ms. Sterling, our clients include Fortune 500 CEOs, government ministers, and international financiers. They expect to work with seasoned professionals who understand the complexities of global markets. I understand the requirements, Victoria said, maintaining her composed demeanor. Perhaps I could demonstrate my qualifications rather than simply discussing them. Richard's smile became predatory. This was exactly the opening he had been hoping for. By all means, let's start with languages. Our last candidate claimed to speak Spanish fluently, but couldn't discuss basic market terminology. How many languages do you speak, Ms. Sterling? Victoria's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, as if she was preparing for something the others couldn't anticipate. I speak 9 languages fluently. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Richard's smile froze on his face as his brain processed what he had just heard. 9 languages. It was such an absurd claim that for a moment he wondered if he had misheard her. Then the laughter began. Richard threw back his head and laughed with genuine amusement, the sound echoing off the boardroom's high ceilings. Margaret joined in with her own incredulous chuckle, while David shook his head in disbelief. Even James, who was typically more restrained, couldn't suppress a skeptical smile. 9 languages, Richard repeated between laughs, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes. Miss Sterling, I appreciate confidence, but let's try to keep our claims within the realm of possibility. I have a Harvard MBA and 30 years of international business experience, and I speak 3 languages competently. The idea that someone your age could speak 9 languages fluently is simply impossible, Victoria suggested quietly, her voice cutting through his laughter like a blade. Well, yes, frankly, Richard said, still chuckling. Look, I'm sure you've studied several languages in school, perhaps spent a semester abroad, maybe watched some foreign films with subtitles. But true fluency in 9 languages requires decades of study and immersion that someone your age simply couldn't have achieved. Margaret leaned forward, her expression a mixture of amusement and pity. Miss Sterling, we deal with reality here, not fantasy. Our clients would be insulted if we sent someone to negotiate with them who thought language learning was some kind of game. Victoria remained perfectly still throughout their reaction, her dark eyes moving from face to face around the table as if she were cataloging their responses for future reference. When their laughter finally subsided, she spoke again. Which languages would you like me to demonstrate? The question hung in the air like a challenge that none of them had expected. Richard's laughter died in his throat as he realized that this young woman wasn't backing down or admitting that her claim had been exaggerated. If anything, she seemed more confident than before. I beg your pardon? Richard said. You seem skeptical about my language abilities, Victoria said, her tone remaining perfectly professional. Rather than continuing to debate the theoretical possibility, why don't you test me? Ask me to demonstrate any of the 9 languages I mentioned. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ms. Sterling, we're not language teachers here. We're business executives who need to assess practical qualifications. Exactly, Victoria agreed. And since international business requires practical language skills, testing my abilities would be a perfectly reasonable part of this interview process. Richard found himself in an unexpected position. He had intended to humiliate this overconfident young woman by exposing her obvious lies, but she was calling his bluff in a way that he hadn't anticipated. If he refused to test her, it might appear that he was afraid of being proven wrong. If he agreed to test her, and she failed spectacularly, which was inevitable, he would have the satisfaction of watching her confidence crumble. Very well, Richard said, settling back into his chair with renewed interest. Let's start with something simple. If you truly speak Spanish fluently, explain to me in Spanish how you would handle a hostile acquisition involving a Mexican telecommunications company. Victoria nodded once, then began speaking in rapid, flawless Spanish that flowed from her lips like music. Her pronunciation was perfect, her grammar impeccable, and her vocabulary sophisticated beyond anything Richard had expected. She discussed complex financial instruments, regulatory frameworks, and cultural considerations with the expertise of someone who had spent years working in Spanish-speaking markets. The executives around the table fell silent as they listened to Victoria's response, which lasted nearly 3 minutes and covered aspects of international mergers that even some of their senior consultants would have struggled to address. When she finished, she translated her entire response into perfect English, demonstrating that her fluency wasn't just memorized phrases, but genuine comprehension and analytical ability. Richard felt his first flutter of genuine surprise, but he wasn't ready to abandon his skepticism. That was adequate, he said grudgingly. But Spanish is hardly an exotic language. Most business schools require at least basic Spanish. Let's try something more challenging. What would you like to hear? Victoria asked. French, Margaret interjected. Discuss the challenges of entering the European luxury goods market. Without hesitation, Victoria launched into an eloquent explanation in French that was even more impressive than her Spanish demonstration. Her accent was perfect Parisian, her technical vocabulary extensive, and her analysis of European consumer behavior revealed deep understanding of cultural nuances that couldn't be learned from textbooks. James was the first to break the stunned silence that followed. How long did you study in France? I've never lived in France, Victoria replied simply. But I spent considerable time studying French literature and business practices through various programs. Richard felt a cold sensation beginning to creep up his spine. 2 perfect demonstrations could possibly be explained by exceptional preparation or natural talent. But 9 languages would require something far beyond normal human capability. Mandarin, he said abruptly. If you can really speak Mandarin fluently, explain the political considerations involved in establishing joint ventures with Chinese state-owned enterprises. Victoria's response in Mandarin was flawless, flowing from her lips with the same natural ease as her native English. The complexity of her discussion, the cultural sensitivity of her analysis, and the perfection of her pronunciation left the entire room speechless. As she finished and provided an English translation, Richard realized that he was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about language acquisition, intelligence, and the relationship between age and expertise. But it was David who asked the question that would begin Richard's complete destruction of his worldview. Ms. Sterling, where exactly did you go to school? Victoria's smile was small but telling. That's an interesting question. Which school did you have in mind? The question about Victoria's educational background hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Richard could see that his senior team was beginning to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, their initial amusement giving way to something that looked disturbingly like respect. This was not how he had planned for this interview to proceed. Ms. Sterling, Richard said, attempting to regain control of the situation, while your language demonstrations have been surprising, I think we need to understand your actual qualifications. Your resume indicates a degree from Columbia University, but it seems rather light on the details we typically expect from candidates for senior positions. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying Richard with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. What specific details would you like me to clarify? Well, for starters, Margaret interjected, Columbia is a fine school, but it hardly explains the level of linguistic competency you've demonstrated. Most Columbia graduates speak 1 or 2 foreign languages at best. That's true, Victoria agreed. Most students focus on traditional academic paths. I took a somewhat different approach to my education. James pulled up Victoria's resume on his tablet, frowning as he read through it again. Ms. Sterling, your resume lists some rather unusual accomplishments. It says here that you served as a translator for the United Nations Development Program, published research in international economics journals, and completed advanced studies in 7 different countries. Could you elaborate on these experiences? Richard felt another flutter of unease. He had been so focused on the language demonstrations that he hadn't carefully reviewed her background materials. Now, as James read through her qualifications, they sounded far more substantial than he had initially assumed. Certainly, Victoria replied. I began working as a translator for various international organizations during my undergraduate years. The UN Development Program hired me for several projects involving economic development in emerging markets. The research publications came out of that work, particularly my analysis of microfinance effectiveness across different cultural contexts. At what age did you begin this work? David asked, his skepticism now mixed with genuine curiosity. I was 18 when I started with the UN. The work required extensive travel and cultural immersion, which is where I developed most of my practical language skills. Richard's mind was racing through the implications of what she was saying. If Victoria had truly been working at the international level since she was 18, it would explain her sophisticated understanding of global business practices. But it would also mean that her experience was far more extensive than that of most candidates twice her age. Miss Sterling, Richard said carefully, you mentioned completing advanced studies in 7 countries. Could you be more specific about that? Victoria's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was evaluating how much information to reveal. I spent 6 months at the London School of Economics studying European integration, a year at the University of Tokyo focusing on East Asian markets, several months at institutions in Switzerland, Singapore, Brazil, and South Africa. Each program was designed to provide deep cultural and economic understanding of those regions. Margaret's eyebrows rose significantly. That represents an extraordinary investment in education. How was such extensive international study funded? Scholarships primarily, Victoria replied. Various organizations were interested in supporting research into cross-cultural business practices. I was fortunate to receive funding that allowed me to study where the expertise was strongest. The room fell silent as the implications of Victoria's background began to sink in. Richard realized that he might be dealing with someone whose qualifications were not just adequate, but potentially superior to anyone else they had ever interviewed. But his ego wouldn't allow him to admit this possibility yet. "Let me ask you something, Ms. Sterling," Richard said, leaning forward with what he hoped was an intimidating expression. "You've demonstrated some impressive language skills, and your background sounds quite exotic. But this position requires someone who can operate at the highest levels of international business. Have you ever actually closed a major deal? Have you ever been responsible for generating significant revenue?" Victoria paused for a moment, as if considering how to answer. "Mr. Blackstone, revenue generation is certainly an important metric of business success, but I'm curious about how you define significant in that context." "Well," Richard said, feeling more confident as the conversation moved toward his area of expertise, "at Blackstone Industries, we measure success in millions of dollars. Our smallest consulting contracts are typically worth at least $5 million. Our major clients pay us $50 to $100 million for comprehensive strategic guidance." "I see," Victoria nodded. "And those figures represent your gross revenue or net profit to the firm?" The question caught Richard off guard. Most candidates would have been impressed by the dollar amounts he had mentioned, not asking for clarification about profit margins. "Those are revenue figures," he admitted, somewhat grudgingly. "What's your typical profit margin on those contracts?" Victoria asked with what seemed like genuine professional interest. Richard felt himself becoming defensive. "Our margins are excellent. We typically achieve 20 to 30% profit on major engagements." "That's quite good for consulting work," Victoria agreed. "Though I imagine your overhead costs are substantial, given the luxury office space and the size of your senior team." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Miss Sterling, are you questioning our business model?" "Not at all," Victoria replied smoothly. "I'm simply trying to understand the financial context within which I would be operating. For example, if I were to bring in new business, what would be the revenue expectations for the International Relations Director role?" David consulted his notes. "We would expect the International Relations Director to generate at least $20 million in new business annually. Within the first year?" Victoria asked. "That would be the goal, yes." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "And if someone were to exceed that expectation significantly, how would such performance be rewarded?" Richard found himself intrigued, despite his determination to find fault with this young woman. "What do you mean by significantly?" "Well," Victoria said, "suppose the International Relations Director were able to generate $100 million in new business within the first year. How would Blackstone Industries structure the compensation for that level of performance?" The number hung in the air like a challenge. $100 million in new business would represent more than double their best year in the company's history. It was such an ambitious figure that Richard's first instinct was to laugh. But something in Victoria's tone suggested that she wasn't engaging in fantasy. She was asking about specific performance metrics, as if she had concrete plans for achieving them. "Ms. Sterling," Richard said slowly, $100 million in new business would be unprecedented for our firm. If someone could actually deliver that level of performance, we would structure a compensation package commensurate with their contribution." "Equity participation?" Victoria asked. "Possibly. Board representation?" Richard paused. The conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Victoria wasn't just asking about employment terms. She was negotiating from a position of strength that seemed completely at odds with her age and appearance. "Ms. Sterling, you seem to be getting ahead of yourself. We haven't even offered you the position yet." Victoria's smile was subtle, but unmistakable. Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your caution, but perhaps I should clarify something about my current situation. What do you mean? You asked whether I had ever closed major deals or generated significant revenue. The answer is yes, though not in the way you might expect. Richard felt his pulse quicken. Go on. Over the past 4 years, I've been working as an independent consultant, specializing in emerging market entry strategies. My clients have included several Fortune 500 companies seeking to expand into markets where cultural and linguistic barriers had previously prevented successful penetration. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of results have you achieved? In the past year alone, my recommendations have generated over $300 million in new revenue for my clients. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt as if the floor had shifted beneath his chair. $300 million would make Victoria one of the most successful consultants in the industry, regardless of her age. Can you substantiate that claim? James asked quietly. Victoria reached into her backpack and withdrew a thin folder. I have letters of recommendation from 6 current clients, including financial performance metrics that demonstrate the impact of my strategic guidance. She slid the folder across the table to Richard, who opened it with trembling hands. The letterhead on the first page belonged to a technology company he recognized as one of the most successful firms in Silicon Valley. As he read through the letter, which detailed Victoria's role in their successful expansion into Southeast Asian markets, he felt his worldview beginning to crack. The second letter was from a pharmaceutical giant, praising Victoria's cultural insights that had enabled them to navigate regulatory challenges in the European Union. The third was from an automotive manufacturer, crediting her with identifying market opportunities in Africa that had generated over $80 million in revenue. Each letter was more impressive than the last, and all of them spoke of Victoria with the kind of respect typically reserved for senior partners at top-tier consulting firms. Richard looked up from the letters to find Victoria watching him with those calm, intelligent eyes. For the first time in his professional life, he felt completely outmatched. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" The question hung in the boardroom air like smoke from an explosion. Richard stared at the letters of recommendation scattered across the mahogany table, each one a testament to Victoria's extraordinary capabilities that completely contradicted his initial assumptions about her worth. His hands shook slightly as he set down the final letter, from a multinational energy company praising her strategic insights that had generated over $100 million in new market penetration. "Ms. Sterling," Richard repeated, his voice hoarse with shock. "Why are you here? With credentials like these, you could start your own firm, demand equity partnerships at any major consultancy, or command 7-figure salaries. Why would you want to work for Blackstone Industries?" Victoria leaned back in her chair, a subtle shift that somehow made her appear more authoritative than the room full of executives who had been trying to intimidate her just minutes earlier. "That's an excellent question, Mr. Blackstone, and I think the answer might surprise you." Margaret, who had been silent since Victoria's revelations began, cleared her throat nervously. "Are we to understand that you've been observing us? Testing us somehow?" "In a sense, yes," Victoria acknowledged. "You see, I've been tracking Blackstone Industries for the past 18 months. Your firm has an interesting reputation in international consulting circles." David's face paled. "What kind of reputation?" Victoria's expression remained neutral, but her words carried the weight of careful observation. "You're known for aggressive tactics, high-margin contracts, and a particular approach to client relationships that prioritizes short-term profits over sustainable development." Richard felt heat rising in his cheeks. "Ms. Sterling, I don't appreciate the implication that—" "I'm not making implications," Victoria interrupted gently. "I'm stating facts based on extensive research. For example, your work with Meridian Corporation in Southeast Asia resulted in significant profits for both companies, but also led to the displacement of over 15,000 local workers and substantial environmental damage that your impact assessments failed to adequately address." The silence that followed was crushing. Richard knew exactly which project Victoria was referencing, and her summary was devastatingly accurate. It had been one of their most profitable engagements, but also one that he preferred not to discuss in detail. "How could you possibly know about those details?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That information was confidential. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since entering the boardroom, it wasn't entirely professional. Mr. Mitchell, I've spent 4 years building relationships with organizations across 6 continents. When consulting firms work in international markets, their reputations precede them. Local communities talk. Environmental groups document impacts. Economic researchers analyze outcomes. Margaret leaned forward, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Blackstone Industries has built its success on a model that generates impressive financial returns while externalizing many of the negative consequences of your recommendations. Your clients achieve their expansion goals, you collect substantial fees, and the long-term costs are borne by communities and ecosystems that have no voice in your boardroom. Richard felt as if he were being dissected by a surgeon who knew exactly where to cut. Every accusation Victoria made was technically accurate, though he had never thought of their business practices in such stark terms. If that's your assessment of our company, he said defensively, why would you possibly want to work here? Victoria's expression grew serious. Because I believe that Blackstone Industries has the potential to become something much more significant than a profit extraction machine. You have the client relationships, the global reach, and the financial resources to be a force for positive change in international development. But you lack the vision and the expertise to realize that potential. David laughed nervously. Are you suggesting that we need to be rescued by a 22-year-old? I'm suggesting that you need to evolve before your business model becomes obsolete, Victoria replied calmly. The international consulting landscape is changing rapidly. Clients are increasingly demanding sustainable solutions that consider long-term social and environmental impacts. Governments are implementing stricter oversight of foreign business practices. Communities are becoming more sophisticated about protecting their interests. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Firms that don't adapt to these new realities will find themselves marginalized within the next decade. Blackstone Industries can either lead this transition or be swept aside by it. Richard found himself in the unprecedented position of feeling both threatened and intrigued. Victoria's analysis was uncomfortably accurate, and her predictions aligned with trends he had been trying to ignore. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. I'm proposing a fundamental transformation of how Blackstone Industries approaches international consulting. Instead of focusing solely on maximizing short-term profits, we would develop strategies that create sustainable value for all stakeholders, clients, local communities, and the firm itself. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And you believe this approach would be more profitable than our current methods? I know it would be, Victoria said with complete confidence, because I've already proven it works. The $300 million in revenue I generated for my clients over the past year came from projects that prioritize sustainable development, community engagement, and environmental responsibility. James pulled out his calculator, his fingers moving rapidly. If those same clients had worked with traditional consulting firms using conventional approaches, what would their results have been? Victoria reached into her backpack again and produced a detailed analysis. Based on comparable projects implemented by firms using standard methodologies, my clients achieved approximately 40% higher revenue generation and 60% lower regulatory complications than industry averages. The numbers were staggering. Richard realized that Victoria wasn't just proposing a more ethical approach to consulting. She was demonstrating that ethical practices could be more profitable than the aggressive tactics that had built his empire. You're saying that your methods produce better financial results while also addressing social and environmental concerns, he asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. Exactly. When you design business strategies that consider the interests of all stakeholders, you create more stable, resilient, and ultimately profitable ventures. Local communities become partners rather than obstacles. Governments become allies rather than regulatory burdens. Environmental sustainability becomes a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. Richard felt his understanding of business fundamentals beginning to shift. For 30 years, he had operated under the assumption that maximizing profits required minimizing costs, even if those costs were simply transferred to others. Victoria was suggesting that this approach was not just morally questionable, but financially suboptimal. Ms. Sterling, he said slowly, If what you're saying is true, why hasn't this approach become standard practice in our industry? Victoria's smile was sad but knowing. Because it requires executives to think beyond quarterly earnings reports and annual bonuses. It requires building relationships instead of extracting value. It requires humility instead of arrogance. And it requires recognizing that the communities you're working in might have wisdom that your MBA programs never taught you. The words hit Richard like physical blows. Every criticism was precisely targeted at the assumptions that had guided his career, the beliefs that had made him feel superior to the rest of the world. "You're describing a complete reimagining of international consulting," Margaret said, her voice thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I'm describing the future of international consulting," Victoria corrected. "The question is whether Blackstone Industries wants to help create that future or be destroyed by it." Richard looked around the table at his senior team, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. Victoria had systematically dismantled every assumption they had made about business, success, and their own competence. "What would this transformation look like in practical terms?" David asked. Victoria opened her backpack one final time and withdrew a bound document that was easily 100 pages thick. "I've prepared a comprehensive analysis of how Blackstone Industries could transition to sustainable consulting practices while increasing profitability by an estimated 200% over the next 5 years. She slid the document across the table to Richard, who stared at it as if it might explode. "You prepared this before coming to the interview?" "I've been preparing this for 18 months, Victoria replied. "Ever since I identified Blackstone Industries as the firm with the greatest potential for positive transformation in the international consulting sector." Richard opened the document and found himself looking at the most sophisticated business analysis he had ever seen. The research was exhaustive, the financial projections were meticulously detailed, and the strategic recommendations were innovative beyond anything his own team had ever produced. "This represents months of work," he said, his voice barely audible. "It represents 4 years of work," Victoria corrected. "Everything I've learned, every relationship I've built, every success I've achieved, has been preparation for this moment." Richard looked up from the document to meet Victoria's steady gaze. "You've been planning to join Blackstone Industries for 4 years?" "I've been planning to transform Blackstone Industries for 4 years," Victoria said. "The question now is whether you're willing to be transformed." The weight of Victoria's proposal settled over the boardroom like a heavy blanket, muffling the usual sounds of New York traffic 52 floors below. Richard held the comprehensive transformation plan in hands that had stopped trembling and started sweating, his eyes scanning pages of analysis that revealed depths of strategic thinking he had never encountered in his 3 decades of business experience. The document was a masterpiece of research and insight. Victoria had dissected every aspect of Blackstone Industries' operations, from their client acquisition strategies to their project implementation methods, from their financial structures to their environmental and social impacts. But more than just criticism, she had provided detailed blueprints for improvement that promised not just ethical enhancement, but dramatic profit increases. "This section on community partnership models," Margaret said, reading over Richard's shoulder, "shows projected cost reductions of 30 to 40% through local collaboration rather than external resource importation." David was studying another section on his tablet. "Her analysis of regulatory compliance suggests we could eliminate most legal complications by designing projects that align with local development priorities rather than circumventing them." James looked up from the implementation timeline. "She's mapped out a transition plan that would allow us to maintain current revenue streams while gradually shifting to the new methodology. No disruption to existing client relationships." Richard felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine intellectual excitement. Not the satisfaction of dominating a competitor or closing a profitable deal, but the pure thrill of encountering ideas that expanded his understanding of what was possible. "Ms. Sterling," he said, setting down the document, "this is extraordinary work, but I have to ask, if you're capable of producing analysis of this caliber, why do you need Blackstone Industries at all? You could implement these strategies through your own firm." Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a fair question, and one I've considered extensively. The truth is, Transformation at the scale I'm envisioning requires resources and relationships that take decades to build. Blackstone Industries has client trust, global reach, and financial capacity that would be impossible for me to replicate independently. But more importantly, she continued, I believe in the power of institutional change. If I start my own firm, I can help a limited number of clients. If I transform Blackstone Industries, I can influence an entire industry. Your firm is respected and imitated by consulting companies worldwide. Changes here would ripple across the global consulting landscape. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. Victoria, what you're proposing is remarkable, but it would require everyone at Blackstone Industries to fundamentally change how they think about business. That's not just a strategic shift. It's a cultural revolution. You're absolutely right, Victoria agreed. And that's exactly why it needs to happen at the leadership level. Cultural change has to be modeled from the top, demonstrated through actions rather than just mandated through policy. Richard found himself studying Victoria with new eyes. When she had first entered the boardroom, he had seen a young woman who didn't belong in his world. Now he realized that she represented everything his world could become if he had the courage to embrace transformation. Let me ask you something, Richard said slowly. If we were to move forward with your proposals, what would be your role in this transformation? Initially, I would serve as International Relations Director, implementing pilot projects that demonstrate the effectiveness of the new approaches. But ultimately, I would expect to be promoted to a position where I could influence company-wide strategy. David's eyebrows rose. You're talking about executive-level responsibility. I'm talking about results-level responsibility, Victoria corrected. Position titles matter less than the ability to create positive change. Richard felt something shifting inside him, a loosening of assumptions that had held rigid for decades. Victoria, I need to be honest with you. Everything you've shown us today challenges fundamental beliefs about how business should be conducted. If we were to implement your recommendations, we would be admitting that our current approach has been suboptimal, Victoria suggested gently. Not malicious, but suboptimal. You've been operating with incomplete information about what drives long-term profitability in international markets. That's a generous way to put it, James said, but accurate. Margaret nodded slowly. I've been wondering for years why our client relationships seem to require so much management, why we faced so many regulatory challenges, why our projects sometimes generated negative publicity despite financial success. Your analysis suggests that these problems aren't inevitable costs of doing business. They're symptoms of flawed methodology. Exactly, Victoria said. When you design business strategies that consider all stakeholders, you eliminate most of the friction that currently consumes your time and resources. Projects become more efficient, communities become partners, and governments become allies. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been the stage for his greatest triumphs. From this height, the people on the streets looked like ants, insignificant and interchangeable. But Victoria's analysis suggested that this perspective might be precisely what had limited his success. Victoria, he said without turning around, if I were to embrace your proposals, what would it mean for the team that's in this room? We've built our careers on the old model. Would we have a place in the new one? Victoria's response came without hesitation. Mr. Blackstone, transformation isn't about replacing people. It's about helping them grow into better versions of themselves. Everyone in this room has valuable skills and experience. The question is whether you're willing to expand your skill sets to include approaches you haven't considered before. Richard turned back to face the room. What would that look like in practical terms? It would mean learning to see communities as partners rather than obstacles. It would mean measuring success by sustainability as well as profitability. It would mean developing cultural sensitivity and emotional intelligence alongside analytical capabilities. Margaret smiled for the first time since the interview began. You're describing a very different kind of executive development than what we're used to. I'm describing executive development that prepares leaders for the realities of 21st century global business, Victoria replied. The old model of command and control leadership is becoming obsolete. Modern international business requires collaboration, adaptability, and genuine respect for diverse perspectives. David was scribbling notes rapidly. The financial projections in your proposal show dramatic revenue increases. How confident are you in those numbers? Completely confident, Victoria said, because they're based on actual results from similar transformations I've guided with other organizations. The methodology is proven. The only question is implementation. James looked up from his own notes. What would be the timeline for this kind of transformation? Victoria opened to a specific section of her proposal. Phase 1 would focus on pilot projects that demonstrate the new approaches while maintaining current operations. This would take approximately 6 months and would generate enough positive results to build internal support for broader changes. Phase 2 would involve systematic implementation across all client relationships, which would take 12 to 18 months. By the end of Phase 2, Blackstone Industries would be operating primarily under the new paradigm while achieving the projected financial improvements. Phase 3 would position the firm as the industry leader in sustainable consulting practices, attracting new types of clients and projects that are currently impossible under the old model. Richard found himself nodding as Victoria outlined the timeline. For the first time in years, he was excited about the future, rather than simply protective of the past. Victoria, he said, I want to ask you one final question before we make any decisions. Of course, what happens if we say no? What happens if Blackstone Industries chooses not to embrace this transformation? Victoria's expression grew serious. Then you'll continue operating under increasingly obsolete assumptions until market forces make your business model unsustainable. Other firms will adopt similar approaches. Your competitive advantages will erode, and within 5 to 10 years, Blackstone Industries will be either acquired by more adaptive companies or forced into irrelevance. The stark assessment hung in the air like a prophecy. Richard realized that Victoria wasn't just offering them an opportunity. She was warning them about an inevitable future that they could either shape or be shaped by. But, Victoria continued, if you choose transformation, Blackstone Industries could become the most influential consulting firm in the world, setting standards that the entire industry would follow for decades to come. Richard looked around the table at his senior team, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their faces. They were at a crossroads that would determine not just the future of their company, but the legacy of their careers. The decision they made in the next few minutes would echo through the rest of their professional lives. The boardroom fell into a profound silence as Richard returned to his seat, the weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. For 30 years, he had built his identity around being the smartest person in every room, the one who saw opportunities others missed, the predator who thrived while others merely survived. Now he faced the humbling reality that a 22-year-old had demonstrated intellectual and strategic capabilities that far exceeded his own. I need to understand something, Richard said, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to show in decades. Victoria, when you walked into this room today, did you know this would happen? Did you plan to completely dismantle everything we thought we knew about our own business? Victoria's expression softened slightly. Mr. Blackstone, I came here hoping to find leaders who were ready to grow. What happened today wasn't an attack on your competence. It was an invitation to expand your definition of success. Margaret leaned forward, her usual corporate composure replaced by genuine curiosity. Victoria, I've been in international business for 20 years, and I've never encountered analysis as comprehensive as what you've presented. How did you develop this level of insight? By listening, Victoria replied simply. For 4 years, I've been working in communities that traditional consulting firms treat as obstacles or resources to be exploited. I've learned to see international business from the perspective of people who are directly affected by corporate decisions, but rarely consulted about them. David set down his calculator, having spent the past 10 minutes working through Victoria's financial projections. The numbers are extraordinary. If we could achieve even half of the projected improvements, it would represent the most successful transformation in corporate consulting history. But it would require us to admit that our current approach has been fundamentally flawed, James added quietly. Richard felt the familiar stirring of his ego, the instinctive resistance to admitting error that had served him well in competitive environments. But as he looked at the evidence spread across the table, Victoria's letters of recommendation, her comprehensive analysis, her detailed transformation plan, he realized that clinging to his old paradigms would be not just foolish but professionally suicidal. Victoria, he said slowly, if we were to move forward with your proposals, I would need guarantees. I would need assurance that this transformation wouldn't destroy everything we've built. Victoria nodded understandingly. That's a reasonable concern. Which is why I've structured the implementation plan to minimize risk while maximizing learning opportunities. We would begin with carefully selected pilot projects that demonstrate the new approaches without disrupting your core business operations. She opened her proposal to a specific section and slid it across to Richard. These 3 client opportunities would be perfect for initial implementation. They represent different geographical regions, different industry sectors, and different types of challenges. Success with these projects would provide proof of concept for broader transformation. Margaret studied the proposed pilot projects. I recognize these clients. They've been considering projects with us, but we've struggled to develop compelling proposals because of the regulatory and community relations complications. Exactly, Victoria said. Under traditional approaches, these projects would be difficult and marginally profitable. Using sustainable consulting methods, they become highly profitable while creating positive social and environmental impacts. Richard found himself leaning forward, his competitive instincts finally aligning with Victoria's vision rather than opposing it. What kind of timeline are we looking at for these pilot projects? 6 months for implementation, with measurable results within 4 months. If the pilots succeed as projected, we would have compelling evidence to present to your board of directors and your broader client base. David was scribbling calculations again. The projected returns on these 3 projects alone would exceed our typical annual profit margins. And that's just the beginning, Victoria added. Success with pilot projects would position Blackstone Industries to compete for larger contracts that are currently closed to firms using traditional methodologies. There's an entire market of socially conscious corporations and government agencies that avoid working with conventional consulting firms. James looked up from his notes. You're describing access to client segments we've never been able to reach. A client base that's growing rapidly as public awareness of sustainability issues increases, Victoria confirmed. Companies that prioritize environmental and social responsibility are becoming the most profitable and fastest-growing segments of the global economy. Richard felt his worldview expanding in real time. For decades, he had dismissed corporate social responsibility as marketing fluff that distracted from serious business. Victoria was demonstrating that social responsibility had become a competitive advantage that he had been ignoring at his own peril. There's something else we need to discuss, Victoria said, her tone becoming more serious. Personal transformation. The methodologies I'm proposing require different leadership skills than what traditional consulting typically demands. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Sustainable consulting requires emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and collaborative leadership styles. It means learning to listen more than you speak, to ask questions more than you provide answers, to build relationships more than you extract value. Richard felt another flutter of resistance. You're describing skills that sound more like social work than business leadership. Victoria's smile was patient, but firm. I'm describing skills that drive superior business results in modern international markets. The old model of authoritarian leadership worked when businesses could operate in isolation from their social and environmental impacts. That world no longer exists. She pulled out her tablet and showed them a series of case studies. These are examples of consulting projects that succeeded or failed based on the leadership approaches used. The pattern is clear. Collaborative leadership generates better financial results than command and control approaches. David studied the data with obvious fascination. These are significant differences in project outcomes. The business world has changed, but many consulting firms haven't adapted their leadership models to match new realities, Victoria explained. Companies that learn to lead collaboratively will dominate the next decade of international business. Richard found himself nodding despite his ingrained skepticism. You're saying that becoming a better person would make me a better business leader? I'm saying that developing emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and collaborative skills would make you dramatically more effective at generating profits in modern international markets, Victoria clarified. The personal growth and business success are interconnected. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Victoria, what you're describing sounds like everything I was taught was wrong about effective leadership. But your results suggest that my training might have been incomplete. Not wrong, Victoria said gently, but designed for a world that no longer exists. The leadership skills that drove success in the 20th century are different from those required for 21st century global business. James set down his pen and looked directly at Victoria. If we agreed to move forward with this transformation, what would be your role in helping us develop these new capabilities? I would serve as both project leader for the pilot implementations and executive coach for the leadership development process. You would learn the new methodologies by applying them to real client challenges while receiving guidance and feedback. Richard felt his pulse quickening with something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about learning. You would teach us to think differently about business? I would help you discover capabilities you already possess but haven't fully developed, Victoria replied. Everyone in this room has intelligence, creativity, and leadership potential that traditional business culture has suppressed in favor of narrow, competitive instincts. The room fell silent as each executive contemplated what Victoria was offering. Not just business transformation, but personal growth that would enhance every aspect of their professional lives. Finally, Richard spoke. Victoria, I want to make you an offer. But first, I need to say something that I've never said in a professional context before. He paused, gathering courage for words that felt foreign in his mouth. I was wrong. About you. About business. About what it means to be intelligent and successful. You've shown me that my assumptions were not just ethically questionable, but strategically flawed. Victoria's expression grew warm, with something that might have been pride or relief. Thank you for saying that. It demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership that makes transformation possible. Here's my offer, Richard continued. I want you to lead our international relations division, but with expanded authority to implement your transformation plan across the entire organization. I want equity participation that reflects your contribution to our success, and I want you to teach all of us how to become the kind of leaders this company needs to fulfill its potential. Margaret, David, and James exchanged glances before Margaret spoke for the group. We're all in agreement. This transformation is exactly what Blackstone Industries needs. Victoria stood and extended her hand across the table to Richard. Mr. Blackstone, I accept your offer, but I want you to understand that this partnership will challenge both of us in ways we can't anticipate. Are you prepared for that? Richard took her hand, feeling the firmness of her grip and the steady confidence in her gaze. Victoria, at my age, I thought I was done learning and growing. You've shown me that the most important part of my education is just beginning. As they shook hands, Richard realized that he was not just hiring an exceptionally talented executive. He was choosing to become a different kind of person, a better leader, and a more conscious participant in the global business community. The transformation of Blackstone Industries was about to begin, but more importantly, the transformation of Richard Blackstone himself was already underway. 1 year later, Richard Blackstone stood in the same boardroom where his worldview had been shattered and rebuilt, but everything else had changed dramatically. The intimidating mahogany table had been replaced with a circular glass surface that encouraged collaboration rather than hierarchy. The walls, once dominated by his personal achievements, now displayed photographs from Blackstone Industries' sustainable development projects around the world. Solar installations in rural Kenya, educational programs in rural Colombia, technological innovations in Southeast Asia that had created thousands of jobs while protecting ancient ecosystems. Victoria entered the room carrying not the worn backpack that had marked her as an outsider a year ago, but a leather portfolio that reflected her position as Chief Strategy Officer and the youngest board member in the company's history. Her casual clothes had been replaced by professional attire that commanded respect without sacrificing authenticity, and her presence filled the space with an authority that had been earned through extraordinary results. "Good morning, Richard," she said, her tone warm but focused. "Are you ready for the Sustainability Summit presentation?" Richard smiled, a genuine expression that would have been impossible during his previous incarnation as a ruthless corporate predator. "As ready as I'll ever be. Though I have to admit, I'm still amazed that we're the ones hosting an international conference on ethical business practices." The transformation of Blackstone Industries had exceeded even Victoria's optimistic projections. The 3 pilot projects she had implemented in her first 6 months had generated over $60 million in revenue while creating measurable positive impacts for local communities and ecosystems. More importantly, they had attracted attention from prospective clients who had previously avoided working with traditional consulting firms. Margaret Hayes, now the company's Director of Community Relations, joined them in the boardroom. Her previous role as VP of Operations had been restructured to focus on building partnerships with local organizations rather than extracting maximum value from international markets. The change had transformed not just her job description, but her entire approach to leadership. The sustainability metrics from our Q4 projects are extraordinary, Margaret reported. We've achieved an average of 40% higher profit margins than our traditional projects, while generating documented positive impacts for over 50,000 people across our active project sites. David Chen, who had evolved from Chief Financial Officer to Director of Impact Investment, added his analysis. The financial benefits of sustainable consulting have been even greater than Victoria predicted. We're attracting premium pricing because clients understand that our methodologies reduce long-term risks while increasing long-term value creation. James Mitchell, now Head of Leadership Development, had perhaps undergone the most dramatic personal transformation. His previous focus on eliminating redundant personnel had evolved into developing human potential throughout the organization. Our employee satisfaction scores have increased by 70% since we implemented collaborative leadership training. More importantly, our team's creative problem-solving capabilities have improved dramatically. Richard reflected on his own journey of personal and professional growth. The authoritarian leadership style that had once defined his identity had given way to a collaborative approach that he found far more fulfilling and effective. Learning to listen rather than dominate, to ask questions rather than provide answers, to build relationships rather than extract value, had revolutionized not just his business results, but his quality of life. There's something I want to share with all of you before we address the conference attendees, Richard said, his voice carrying an emotion that would have been unthinkable during his previous incarnation. 12 months ago, I thought I understood what success looked like. I measured everything in terms of profit margins, competitive advantages, and market dominance. Victoria sat down across from him, her expression encouraging him to continue. What I've learned over this past year is that those metrics were not just morally inadequate. They were strategically incomplete. True success, sustainable success, requires consideration of impacts that traditional business models systematically ignore. Margaret nodded. The irony is that caring about social and environmental outcomes has made us more profitable, not less. Because when you design business strategies that benefit all stakeholders, you create more stable, resilient, and ultimately profitable enterprises, Victoria added. It's not a trade-off between ethics and economics. It's recognition that true economic success depends on ethical practices. David pulled up their annual performance summary on the wall display. The numbers tell the story better than any speech could. Revenue up 230%, profit margins improved by 40%, client retention approaching 100%, and employee turnover reduced to essentially zero. But the numbers don't capture the most important change, James observed. We've become a company that people are proud to work for, that communities welcome rather than fear, that governments see as partners rather than threats. Richard looked around the table at colleagues who had become not just business partners but genuine friends united by shared values and common purpose. Victoria, I need to ask you something. A year ago, when you walked into this room and systematically destroyed every assumption I held about business and leadership, did you know we would end up here? Victoria's smile combined wisdom and humility in equal measure. I knew that transformation was possible, but I couldn't have predicted how profound the changes would be. Honestly, I hoped for business improvement and ethical enhancement. I didn't anticipate the personal growth that would occur throughout the organization. The personal growth has been the most valuable aspect of this entire process, Margaret reflected. Learning to see communities as partners rather than obstacles, developing cultural sensitivity, practicing collaborative leadership. These skills have enhanced every aspect of my professional life. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had once symbolized his dominance but now represented opportunities for positive impact. In 2 hours, we'll be addressing business leaders from 60 countries who are here to learn about sustainable consulting practices. A year ago, the idea that Blackstone Industries would be teaching ethics to other companies would have been absurd. Today, we're recognized as the industry leader in sustainable business transformation, Victoria said. But more importantly, we've proven that doing good and doing well are not just compatible. They're synergistic. David was reviewing the conference agenda on his tablet. The session on collaborative leadership has the highest advance registration. Business leaders around the world are recognizing that command and control management is becoming obsolete, because the global economy is evolving toward greater interconnectedness, transparency, and social consciousness, James added. Companies that don't adapt their leadership styles will be left behind by market forces. Richard returned to his seat, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing throughout his previous career. You know what amazes me most? I spent 30 years trying to accumulate power, influence, and wealth. Now I have more of all three than I ever dreamed possible. But they came as byproducts of focusing on something more important, creating positive change. Victoria nodded. That's the paradox of sustainable success. When you stop chasing profit as an end in itself and start pursuing profit as a means to positive impact, you often achieve greater financial success than you would through purely self-interested strategies. Margaret checked her watch. We should probably review the presentation materials one final time before the conference begins. Actually, Victoria said, I think there's one more thing we need to discuss. The success of Blackstone Industries' transformation has attracted attention from organizations around the world. We've received inquiries about replicating our methodology in other industries, other countries, other types of institutions. David looked up with interest. Are you talking about franchising our approach? I'm talking about something more ambitious, Victoria replied. I'm talking about creating a global network of organizations committed to proving that sustainable practices drive superior results across every sector of the economy. Richard felt his pulse quicken with familiar excitement, but this time it was directed toward creating positive change rather than dominating competitors. You're describing a movement that could transform the entire global economy. I'm describing the inevitable future of the global economy, Victoria corrected. The question is whether we want to help lead that transformation or simply observe it from the sidelines. James was scribbling notes rapidly. What would be the structure of such a network? Victoria opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that was even more comprehensive than the transformation plan she had presented a year earlier. I've been developing this concept for the past 6 months, building on everything we've learned from our own transformation process. As she outlined her vision for a global network of sustainable organizations, Richard realized that Victoria's ambitions extended far beyond transforming a single consulting firm. She was architecting a fundamental shift in how the world conducted business, with Blackstone Industries serving as the proof of concept for a new economic paradigm. This is extraordinary, Margaret said, reading through Victoria's proposal. You're talking about changing how businesses operate on every continent. I'm talking about demonstrating that sustainable practices aren't just ethically superior, they're economically superior, Victoria replied. When that becomes undeniable, market forces will drive adoption faster than any regulatory mandate could achieve. Richard looked at the young woman who had walked into his boardroom 1 year ago and completely revolutionized his understanding of success, leadership, and purpose. Victoria, you've already transformed my company and my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Now you're proposing to transform the global economy? Victoria's smile was confident but grounded. I'm proposing that we work together to create a world where businesses succeed by solving problems rather than creating them, where prosperity is shared rather than hoarded, where economic growth enhances rather than degrades the communities and ecosystems that sustain us. Richard extended his hand across the table, not to seal a business deal, but to commit to a mission that transcended any individual or organization. Victoria, if you're ready to change the world, Blackstone Industries is ready to help you do it. As they shook hands, Richard realized that his greatest success hadn't been building a billion-dollar company. It had been learning to see beyond his own limitations, to embrace transformation, and to recognize that true leadership meant empowering others to achieve more than they had ever thought possible. The conference would begin in an hour, but the real work of changing the world had been underway for months, and it was just getting started. 2 hours later, as Richard stood before an audience of international business leaders and delivered the opening address of the Global Sustainability Summit, he spoke words that would have been impossible for him to utter just 1 year earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today not to discuss whether sustainable business practices are possible, but to demonstrate that they are profitable, scalable, and essential for the future of global commerce. The transformation of Blackstone Industries proves that any organization can evolve beyond its current limitations to achieve greater success while creating positive impact for all stakeholders. As applause filled the auditorium, Richard caught Victoria's eye from the front row. Her proud smile reminded him that the most important lesson he had learned wasn't about business strategy or financial optimization. It was about the power of humility, the importance of growth, and the recognition that the best teachers often come in forms we least expect. The girl who had proudly declared that she spoke 9 languages had taught him to speak the only language that truly mattered, the language of positive change.